Hi. In the last tutorials, we went over some basic features that you can use in Solidworks. In this tutorial, I want to cover the sketch um, commands and the ways that you can create sketches with constraints in Solidworks. So open up a new part, and we're going to come over here to the sketch tab. We're going to click on new sketch, and let's select our top plane. Now that we're in the sketch, um, let's start off with one of the simplest tools within the sketch command, and that's the line. So I'm going to come over here and I'm just going to click on the line. And so I can create a line by clicking, and then could see my line changes distance based on how long or short it is. So when I click again, the line is created, and it creates another line, and I can continue to do this process indefinitely. When I want to finish the line, I just right click and hit select, and my line is created. So let me just select all this and hit delete. Now let's create another line, but this time we're going to dimension it. So I'm going to click on the origin, and that's going to allow me to start on the origin. I'm going to come out, and on the keyboard I'm just going to type in 100, and I'm going to right click select. Now I made a line. And so from here, I'm going to just, when I go to smart dimension it, it's going to come up as 100 millimeters, because that was the value that I typed in before. So I'm going to hit OK. And so I'm just going to hit the check mark. So this line is 100 millimeters long. And from here, I can go in and I can create another line. And this line, I'm just going to place it here. I'm not going to set a dimension yet. Right click, select. Now my line is placed accordingly. But now I want to show the ways to constrain these lines. So if I select this line and I select this line, these relations are now shown. Now that doesn't happen when you select one of the lines. There are only three relations that you can choose from, because a line on its own can be either horizontal, vertical, or fixed. Those are the only options. But if you select both of them, there are more options, because the two lines together have a lot of relationships between them. For instance, I can make these perpendicular, which would give me a 90-degree angle. Just gonna Control Z. I could make these, if I detach this point and I just have the line floating the way it was, I can click on both of them and I could set them to be parallel, and now they're parallel. I'm going to Control Z. Or I could set them to be collinear, and now they're collinear. And this relationship, the great thing about it is that it's a constraint, so I can still dimension this line to be any dimension I want it to be, but that constraint of having it being collinear, that's true everywhere. So I can go in and click on smart dimension, come over, click on this point, click on this point. That makes a dimension between them. Click again, type in 50, and hit the check mark. Now I have 50 millimeters between them. And so as you can see, the lines, they turn to the color black when they're fully constrained. When they're fully constrained, it means that they cannot move at all anymore. They're fully constrained in all of their degrees of freedom. When you attach a part of the line to the origin, when you attach the point on the line to the origin, then it's fully locked to the origin. And that's something that's set by default. And so the only thing I needed to do here was add a dimension, because it's constrained to the point here. It has a horizontal constraint. And so between being coincident with the origin, being horizontal, and having a dimension, those three constraints have fully constrained the line. And so you can see here, this line is collinear to this one. So it's constrained in 2 degrees of its freedom, because it's only constrained in 2 ways. It's constrained with this dimension, 50 millimeters from this point, and also it's collinear with this line. And that when you click on the line, it shows the constraint, and you can hover over it. And when you hover over it, it'll show you the whatever it's being constrained to. And the other thing to note is that this point, if you look closely, is blue. And the reason is because that point is not constrained the way the rest of the line is. This point can move, but I can't move this point. This one's constrained. So it's something that it may take a little practice. I believe, like when I was first learning this, just working at it, creating lines, playing around with the constraints, clicking on 2 lines, for instance, and seeing the ways that you can add relations is the best way to learn this. So I'm going to come here and select the lines and delete them. And I'm going to do another example now. So let's make a circle on the origin. So I clicked on the origin. That's in my belief the best way to start a part. It should always be constrained from the origin. That way you know where your part begins, where the origin of that part is. So always start on the origin. Just as a cliff note, you really don't want to be starting parts just in the middle of nowhere, because this point can be dragged around. This part, it's not constrained to anything. It should always start on the origin. So as you can see, once it's on the origin, it can't be dragged anywhere, but I can change the dimension. So I'm going to come up here, Smart Dimension, click on the circle. By default, it's going to show the diameter. So I'm going to click, and 30 millimeters is fine. Now hit OK. So now we have a 30 millimeter in diameter circle. And from here, I'm going to be able to, if I want to, come up here, create a line. Just going to click and click again, and right click select. So now we're done. You can also, for the record, once you click down, you can hit escape on your keyboard, and then that's going to just get rid of the creating a second line and a third line and a fourth line. It's just going to allow you to make one at a time. Let me delete that. So here I'm going to show you another constraint that you can use. I'm going to click on this line, and I'm going to click on this circle, and I'm going to come over here to these relations. I'm going to click on tangent. So now the line is tangent to the circle. And so you could see if I drag this point, it's always going to be tangent to it. I can drag it around. It's always going to be tangent to the circle. So that can be very useful for many mechanical applications. Okay. Let me delete this. And we're going to come up here, and we're going to create a couple more different shapes. As you can see, there's a multitude of different shapes when you click on the arrow. There's a line, there's a center point, midpoint line. For now, we're just going to be working with a regular line. Here, you can create a perimeter circle, which is a little bit different than a regular circle. With the perimeter circle, it's more about the 3 points that touch than the center. Also, same thing with splines. You can create a style spline or a regular one, or even create one with an equation. But for now, we're going to come down here and click on Polygon. And so here it gives you a couple options, what you would expect. I can set this to be 5 to create a pentagon. I can also come down and just make it 3. So I can click on the origin again. When I drag out, it's going to be triangle as expected. Select. Okay. So now that we have our triangle, I can create a constraint. I can create a center rectangle, and I could, if I move my cursor to here, you could see that it creates this sort of dotted line between the origin and the square. So I'm going to create my center rectangle and hit OK. And now if I click on this point and I click on the center point of the rectangle, I can, this becomes bold because it thinks, because the software is smart enough to realize that you put these 2 points to be horizontal already because of that dotted line that SolidWorks gave us. So if I click on horizontal for the relation, it's going to automatically set that to be horizontal. And again, I know it can be a little confusing to watch someone else do this, but I definitely hope that you'll do this on your own. Just practicing, that's the real way to learn this. But as you can see, this moves as you would expect horizontally. And so that constraint works from the origin. So I can create another shape here, and I can hit OK. So if I want to, I can create a line from here to this shape and hit select. And just with a dimension, I can create a dimension of the height of the line, and then if I hit OK, that's going to allow me to rotate this because the line cannot get any longer. If I select this circle and this line, you're going to see it only gives me a few options. It gives me tangent and fix. I think if I hit tangent, I'm going to be in trouble. Yeah, that's not going to work because you can't make a line that's constrained to the center of the circle to be tangent with it. So SolidWorks doesn't allow you to create relations that are not computable. So if I just want to show that one more time, if I hit tangent, it's going to come up in red here. It's going to say unsolvable. The item is unsolvable. It means that it's impossible to create this relation with the way that the drawing is constrained. So I'm going to just hit back. Now if I create another line here, I'm just going to hit create this line. Now I'm going to check this line. I can do equal. So the way that this is 29.24 millimeters, I selected these two lines. One is dimensioned, one is not. When I hit equal, now they're both going to be the same size. This line is now this size. So if I come in and I change this size to be 35, these lines are linked. They're linked by the dimension. So that's definitely something to use as a good tool. As you would imagine, I can also create a dimension between these two lines. And that dimension, I can set it to be maybe 30 degrees. And so that's going to constrain them in that way as well. And the thing to understand, I think, is when you're designing parts out of sketches, you're going to be using dimensions and you're going to be using constraints. And dimensions and constraints are both, they kind of work together, but you don't want to add dimensions unless you need to. For instance, now let me delete all of this and show another example. If I want to create a right angle, so I'm going to create a line, and now I'm going to create another line. Let me just put it here for now. Now, this line and this line, I want them to be 90 degrees to each other. I could do that in two ways. I can click on this line and drag out a dimension and type in 90 and hit the check mark, and that'll give me 90 degrees, and that's perfectly fine. But that's an extra dimension, and the more dimensions you have, the larger the file size gets, and the more complicated your sketch is, which can be detrimental, especially when you're working with large assemblies. I'm going to delete this. I can instead just click on these two lines and make them, you guessed it, perpendicular. So now they're perpendicular. And that accomplishes the same thing that I was able to accomplish with the 90 degrees. So you can see if I try to make a 90 degrees on top of a perpendicular, it's gonna say, hey, wait a second, you're already fully constrained. You already made 90 degrees using this. So when you create a dimension on top of that, it's going to ask you, do you want the dimension to drive the 90 degrees, or do you want the constraint to drive the 90 degrees? In this example, I'm actually going to make the dimension drive it. So I'm going to hit OK. Now if I hit escape, I can go in and change this. So as you can see, the dimension, it's driven. So it can't be changed. It's driven by the constraint. Now if I click on the constraint that we set for perpendicularity and I delete it, now all of a sudden I can come in and I can set the dimension to be 90, and I can make it 90. I can double click on it again and change it to be 95, and it's gonna move. But like I said before, with the perpendicular constraint, you can't have both of them. See, it's telling me that it's overdefined now. Now I'm going to go back. So that's an example of how you can use dimensions and constraints together. Mistakes to avoid: you can't have perpendicular and a 95-degree dimension. That's just not possible when you really think about it, just in terms of geometry. We'll go over a few more things here. So let's create an arc. I'm going to create a 3-point arc. So I'm going to click on the origin for my first point. I'm going to just click out here kind of randomly. Or actually, you know what? Let's make it horizontal with the origin. So as you can see, it gives me this dotted line when I set my cursor to be horizontal with the origin. Now I can click again. And the third point, I'm just going to set it to be, you can actually see the dimension changing. I'm just going to set it to be here. I'm going to hit OK. So between these 2 points, I'm going to set this to be horizontal. And as you can see, now these 2 points can only move when they're horizontal to each other, even though the curve can change a dimension. So I'm going to come up to Smart Dimension, click on it, set a dimension to be 25 millimeters, and hit OK. And now we have an almost fully constrained arc. The last thing to dimension is the length between these 2 points. Now let's say that I had another shape here. It was a rectangle. And this rectangle is horizontal with the origin point. So let's say that this rectangle, from the center of it to the origin, is 50 millimeters. Now I can drag this point to the end of the box, and I can constrain my box to be, say, 20 millimeters. And you can see that this actually turned black because now it's fully constrained. So when I change this dimension, the dimension of the arc should change as well. And you can see that the arc gets smaller and smaller and smaller. And it's funny, you could see that the rectangle is getting larger and larger because it's simply not constrained in a certain direction. So let me add that other direction. I'm just going to click on this line, drag it out, and we'll just set it to 20. So I'm going to just hit OK. So this is the way that you can kind of drive one shape to control another shape. You can see here I have this set to 50, I have this set to 50. this curve, it doesn't have any horizontal length dimension. If I change this to be 20, like I said before, this is going to change too. So it's controlled by it. I could set this to 60 and it's just going to get smaller and smaller and smaller. And I can even change this to just make the whole rectangle itself move to the right. So this is the way that the relations are. You can kind of control um, the length of something based on another shape. So that's going to delete that. Another quick thing to know when you're working with sketches um, is I can come up here, create a line, click on the origin. Now I'm going to drag it out. I'm going to make it horizontal. Maybe I'll come up. Maybe I'll come like this. And let's close off this shape. So I'm going to come back, click here, hit OK. Now let's add a couple dimensions. Maybe I want to drag this up. If I see I can drag this line up, and then since nothing is really constrained, it's very easy to manipulate this. So as you can see, these lines are black and everything else is blue, so it's very easy to manipulate it. There are some constraints that SolidWorks kind of adds from the beginning. This is vertical, this is vertical, this is of course horizontal, this is horizontal, but I could easily come in and just delete these constraints. I could just hit delete, and then before you know it, I can move this the way I want it to. I can come up here, click on this constraint, delete that. Now I can move this the way I want it to. But anyway, I'm going to show you a way to make it a little easier to work with lines and with other curves. So I'm going to click on the point here at the top. I'm going to create a point on the line, and I'm going to hit OK. And if I come up here to trim entities, we're going to click on that. And see, it doesn't recognize maybe the power trim. This tool, actually, I believe I need to create my mistake. I believe I need to create a line here if I'm gonna trim to closest. So this tool, trim to closest, when you click on the trim entities here, is going to allow you to cut the line and have it be completely deleted. Let it be known that you can't use points. That's something that I wasn't aware of. Usually lines are often intersecting your design, so I can click on this, delete that, delete that. I can delete this whole line, delete this whole line, delete this whole line very easily with that tool. I can create a curve, and when it passes through lines, I can come up here to trim entities and just delete this, and now you can see that I have a nice curve inside here that I can use for whatever application. I'm going to close this shape. So that's definitely another thing to note there. And trim entities has a few different styles of trimming. I mostly just use trim to closest because it's just going to trim to the closest intersection point. So that means that the closest intersection point is this line. So this line would be deleted, or this line would be deleted. Likewise on the bottom, you have one curve coming down and it's intersecting this line, so it would delete this or it would delete that. There are a few other tools here, but I really do believe that trim to closest is kind of all you really need. If you want to work a little bit faster, you can click on power trim, which is the one at the top, and that actually allows you to create a line, as you can see, a line that just, as you move through it, it just deletes everything in its path. So if I create, you know, a line, whatever, just any shapes that are in its path, when I create the power trim, I can just cut through everything to the closest point. So that pretty much sums it up. Like I said before, this is something that just comes with practice. It comes with getting used to all the tools. I hope you were able to get some value out of this. I know I'm going a little bit quickly. Really, the best way to learn is from playing around and working with the lines and constraints. Um, for instance, I can drag this over here. I can create a dimension between these two, and then I can also click on these two lines, and if I try to make them parallel, it's going to be unsolvable. If I try to make them perpendicular, obviously um, it's going to make it perpendicular, but the dimension is still going to stay. So because it wasn't constrained to begin with. So that's just something that comes with experience. I could have either made these perpendicular, or I could have clicked on this line and this line, and I could have made it collinear. And you can actually see that it's the same result, whether you make it collinear or whether you set these to be perpendicular. So that's just part of the learning experience. Another thing is, these lines are vertical, but if you want to, you can delete these two vertical constraints, which is going to allow you to move your two lines any way you want. Now, of course, these two are still constrained, so they're both going to be parallel. The top and bottom lines are parallel, but the ones on the left and right, they can move at whatever angle. So as you can see, you get a really interesting control over your shape. So, and of course, this has these extra lines, which changes things. If you don't have um, the two dotted lines, center lines, and it's not gonna behave like that. But anyway, instead of making these vertical, you can double click and just make them parallel. You can make them parallel to each other. Now they're parallel. And then if I want to lock this shape into place, I can click on these two lines and make them perpendicular. Or I could come up and make 90 degrees here between these two. And I could delete that. I can come here. I can make them vertical. See what happens. Now it doesn't let me do that. I could try to make it horizontal. Now the whole thing is on its side. So now it just turns into one line. But like I mentioned before, it's really just something to play around with to get a good feel of how the software and the sketch tools work. So I hope you got a lot of value out of this video, and I'll see you in the next one. Thank you.